Have you heard of this guy, Steve Witkoff? He's a real estate developer and pal of Donald Trump who has now been thrust into a diplomatic role for which he is clearly unqualified. Trump made him the lead negotiator between Russia and Ukraine for an attempted ceasefire, despite his lack of diplomatic experience. Witkoff recently had several interviews on Tucker Carlson and Fox News Channel, though, those bastions of journalistic integrity. Playing to this easily duped audience, Witkoff praised Putin and then repeated Russian propaganda, which is sadly becoming the norm for the Trump administration. On Fox News Channel, when asked about Vladimir Putin's track record of murdering political opponents and atrocities in Ukraine, Witkoff glibly stated, quote, "There are two sides to every story." There are two sides to murder, Steve? I guess if you consider the murderer, Russia and Putin, on one side, and the 10,000 Ukrainian civilians murdered in their homes on the other, yeah. Why don't you come with me to Ukraine, Steve, and you can explain to the relatives of the murdered civilians Putin's side of the story. I'm sure they're eager to know his logical explanation for why their relatives are no longer here. And then he went on Tucker Carlson, and there he waxed poetic about how Putin gave him a painting to give Trump after Putin had gone to church to pray for Trump after his so-called assassination attempt. Steve was really moved by this. This is rich. Vladimir Putin, a former KGB agent, came to power in Russia when he murdered over 300 of his own fellow citizens in an orchestrated apartment bombing in 1999. He did all this so he could garner support and play a tough guy leader and blame it on Chechnyan terrorists. He then proceeded to do in Chechnya what he's trying to do now in Ukraine, which is to wipe Chechnya off the map so Russia can subjugate it and control it, killing tens of thousands of civilians in the process. To even suggest that a mass murdering war criminal who runs Christian torturing Russia is praying to anyone about anything stretches the bounds of ridiculousness. But perhaps the dumbest thing Witkoff said was that he trusted Putin when Putin said he wanted nothing but peace and had no intention to invade the rest of Europe. Do you know how often Putin said the same thing leading up to the Ukrainian full invasion in 2022, Steve? Here's a hint. Dozens. Then Witkoff went on to repeat Russian propaganda that Russia occupying parts of Ukraine is justified because some people there speak Russian and there have been referendums. Steve, please study history, dude. Everyone in Soviet Ukraine was taught only the Russian language in schools for decades. So yeah, a lot of people still speak some Russian. In Cajun Louisiana, people still speak French. Should we give part of Louisiana to France? Or what about South Texas, where Spanish is spoken? Should we cede that slice of Texas to Mexico? Should Puerto Rico just go to Spain? This would be funny if it weren't so serious. But this isn't a game. Lives are at stake. Ukraine isn't an office building in an undeveloped part of town, Steve. It's not a real estate deal. Ukraine is a big country with 40 million people and a hell of a lot of farmland that feeds the world. Many Ukrainians are being tortured right now in Russian-occupied parts of Ukraine. Should Georgia give up Russian-occupied land in Ossetia? Do you know where Georgia is? I'm not talking about the state. I'm talking about the country, Steve. Should Moldova give them Transnistria? It sure sounds like you're on the side of invading war criminals, Steve, rather than the rule of law, the right side of history, and the United States of America. As far as those so-called referendums, Witkoff is referring to the sham referendums after Putin illegally invaded Crimea and eastern Ukraine in 2014. After displacing millions like my pal Anastasia and her family, Putin then forced the remaining citizens to vote under threat of gunpoint from the Russian military. If a Russian soldier is holding a gun on you, who would you vote for, Steve? That's why nobody but rogue states like North Korea, China, or Iran recognizes these referendums, Steve. Is that who you're aligning the U.S. with now? The certitude of Witkoff's ignorance is astounding. But even a hack real estate developer with no diplomatic experience should know better. It really isn't that hard. Some people are concluding that Witkoff is simply out of his depth and is being played by Putin, but I beg to differ. I don't think Witkoff is being played by Putin. I think he's being paid by Putin.